If you made it this far into this video, then you're already listening to something that was never meant to leave the field. What I'm about to tell you was never written down, never logged, never acknowledged during my years in service. These were incidents that didn't fit into reports, so they were quietly ignored instead. But you need to understand this from the start. What's truly disturbing isn't just what happened out there. It's the fact that everyone knew something was wrong and still chose to stay silent. My name is Evan Calder. I was a U.S. Forest Service ranger assigned to the Black Elk Wilderness Corridor in northern Wyoming. I worked that region for 14 years, most of them alone. On Christmas night, backup was over an hour away. One ranger covering nearly 80 square miles of forest. I thought I understood this job. I was wrong. There are things I learned that night. Things that don't exist in manuals, weren't taught in training, and never made it into an official report. And once you see them, the forest never looks the same again. I've told myself for years that some stories are better left buried under snow and time. This is one of them. Not because it's unbelievable, but because it's too real. Christmas night was supposed to be quiet. No hikers, no campers. Just me, the radio, and the forest settling into winter. I was a senior ranger on duty, which meant every call stopped with me. When the first transmission came through, broken, breathless, wrong, I almost logged it as interference. That hesitation still wakes me up, usually around the same hour it happened. If you've ignored a gut feeling because protocol told you to wait, you already understand the weight on my chest that night. I had sworn an oath to protect that land. What I didn't know was that something out there didn't want to be found, and didn't want anyone crossing the tree line after dark. Then the radio screamed again. Then the radio screamed again, and before I answered it, I looked out at the forest like it might look back. The Black Elk Wilderness Corridor isn't marked the way most protected land is. No glossy signs. No visitor centers glowing warm against the cold. It stretches across northern Wyoming in a long, broken swath of timber, rock, and ravine that never quite made it into the tourism brochures. On maps it looks empty. On the ground it feels occupied. Winter comes early there and stays late. By Christmas, snow doesn't fall so much as settle, layer by layer, until the land looks preserved instead of alive. Pines sag under weight. Creeks freeze mid-motion. Sound travels strangely, as if the cold itself absorbs it. You can shout and hear nothing come back. Historically, the corridor was bypassed. Old wagon routes curved away from it. Early logging outfits tried, failed, and left equipment half buried where it broke. Even now, satellite images show gaps where nothing ever grew back quite right. Officially, it's blamed on soil composition and elevation. Unofficially, nobody local argues when you suggest the land simply doesn't want to be disturbed. Human presence is thin by design. A handful of seasonal cabins sit miles apart, most unoccupied by December. The nearest town shuts down early during winter storms, and Christmas week empties it further. Families stay in. Travelers don't linger. If you break down on the access road after dark, there's a good chance no one will pass until morning. As rangers, we were trained to respect isolation without fearing it. But there was an unspoken rule everyone learned fast. Avoid deep patrols after dark in winter. It never appeared in manuals. No supervisor ever said it outright. It lived in the pauses between sentences, the way veterans changed the subject when certain drainages came up, the way keys stayed on hooks after sunset. The reasoning was practical on paper. Hypothermia, zero visibility, limited radio range, one ranger covering too much ground. But that logic didn't explain why even daytime patrols felt different after Christmas, or why compasses occasionally drifted in certain pockets, or why trail cameras failed in patterns instead of randomly. Locals noticed those things long before we did. They spoke about the forest with careful language, never dramatic, never dismissive. During Christmas week, they brought groceries home early and kept porch lights burning all night. Kids were told not to wander, not because of wildlife, but because the woods listened when it was quiet. People who grew up near places like this know the difference between superstition and survival. I learned quickly to pay attention when an old rancher refused to cross the tree line after dusk, even to retrieve lost cattle. When a woman at the gas station warned me not to answer voices I recognized out there. When a volunteer firefighter admitted he'd rather battle a blaze than search those woods in winter. The forest wasn't hostile. That's the part people misunderstand. It didn't feel angry. It felt patient, like something that had outlasted everything else and could afford to wait. The trees crowded closer the farther you went in, trunks dark and straight, branches knit together overhead until the sky became an afterthought. Snow erased mistakes slowly, not all at once. Tracks lingered just long enough to be followed, then softened, then vanished. Rangers joked about it, but no one laughed hard. We logged missing hikers almost every year, usually explained away by exposure or misjudgment. But the maps never quite matched the paths we found, and the distances never added up the same way twice. By my 14th winter, I knew which areas to leave alone, which ridges made the radio hiss, which valleys felt wrong in a way I couldn't justify in reports. I told myself it was experience sharpening instinct. I told myself professionalism meant ignoring the rest. That confidence was easier to hold during daylight. Christmas night stripped that illusion away. The forest seemed closer, tighter, as if the dark pressed inward from every direction at once. Even the animals behaved differently. No tracks, no distant movement, no scavenger calls. Just a deep, waiting stillness that settled into your bones and refused to leave. I stood there with the radio crackling in my hand, thinking about all the warnings that were never written down, thinking about how thin the line was between knowledge and denial, thinking about how many times I'd told myself that nothing out there was personal, that land couldn't remember names or patterns or mistakes. Forest Service protocol treats land as terrain, something to be measured and managed, reduced elevation profiles and fire risk assessments. But out there, those categories always felt inadequate. The corridor behaved less like geography and more like memory. Certain paths felt worn not by feet, but by repetition. Certain clearings carried a weight that had nothing to do with weather. Senior rangers used humor to soften it. Jokes about the woods playing tricks. About cold getting into your head. But humor stops where fear begins, and fear showed up in small, consistent ways. A pause before answering the radio. A reluctance to log night mileage. A tendency to double-check locks that didn't really need it. I remember one winter briefing where a supervisor reminded us to trust our instruments over our instincts. He meant well. Instruments don't panic. Instruments don't imagine things. But instruments also don't feel watched or sense when silence becomes intentional. Out there, instinct filled gaps no equipment could reach. During Christmas week, the corridor changed its posture. The light stayed low even at noon. Shadows stretched in directions that didn't match the sun. Snow reflected sound inward instead of outward, making your own breathing feel too loud. More than once, I caught myself whispering, as if volume mattered. Locals adjusted without comment. Church services ended early. Snowmobiles stayed closer to town. Even the bar closed before midnight on Christmas Eve. When asked why, people shrugged or changed subjects. The explanation was always the same in spirit, if not in words. It's better be inside. People who grew up near places like this don't need explanations. They recognize when land sets boundaries. They know when curiosity becomes disrespect. They understand that not everything dangerous announces itself with noise or movement. Sometimes danger is an absence. Sometimes it's a familiarity that doesn't belong. I'd spent years convincing myself that awareness was enough, that knowing the patterns kept me safe, that the forest and I had reached an understanding. Standing there that night, radio pressed in my ear, I realized how fragile that belief had always been, because something was reaching out, not crashing through the trees, not stalking in the open, just speaking, calmly, from a place that should have been empty. And as the cold crept higher into my gloves, I understood why no one patrolled deep after dark. The forest didn't need us. It only needed one mistake. I adjusted my grip on the radio and forced myself to breathe slowly, the way training taught. Identify, assess, respond. Simple steps meant to keep emotion out of the equation. But emotion was already there, heavy and insistent, threading itself through every thought. The forest waited. I could feel in the stillness, in the way the cold no longer felt passive. This was the region no one patrolled, not because we couldn't, but because somewhere deep down we knew we shouldn't. That knowledge had never felt urgent until now. Snow creaked beneath my boots as I shifted my weight, and the sound felt louder than it should have, like a signal. My breath fogged the air and vanished too quickly. Whatever was on the other end of that transmission was patient. It didn't repeat itself. It didn't rush me. It already knew I was listening. I raised the radio, thumb hovering over the transmit button, aware that once I answered, the night would stop being theoretical and start becoming something else entirely. That was the moment I crossed from routine into something I was never trained for. And I answered. The voice came back immediately, as if it had been waiting for permission, steady and controlled, using codes only rangers use, calling for assistance from a location that should not have existed on any map, especially not on Christmas night. My stomach tightened as I logged the coordinates, because they pointed straight toward the deepest stretch of the corridor, beyond the tree line we all pretended was just another boundary. And before I could reconsider protocol or fear, I turned toward the forest and started walking. The radio crackled once more, softer this time, closer. Waiting. I answered. Unit 12 responding. I said, keeping my voice level professional. Repeat your last transmission. For a moment there was nothing but static. Not the usual hiss. This was thicker, uneven, like something breathing too close to the mic. I slowed my steps, boots crunching softly as the forest pressed in. Then the voice came back. Copy. Unit 12, it said. There was a delay between the words, each one arriving a fraction too late, as if it had been assembled somewhere else and sent piece by piece. Requesting assistance. I'm off trail. Cold. Lost visibility. It used the right phrasing. Almost. But the cadence was wrong. Ranger codes are drilled into you until they're muscle memory. This voice hit them like it had learned by listening, not by doing. Identify, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. This is Ranger Ross, the voice replied. Caleb Ross, junior trainee. My grip tightened on the radio. Caleb wasn't supposed to be out there. He'd finished his seasonal rotation weeks earlier. A good kid, quiet, the kind who listened more than he talked. He'd asked too many questions, of thoughtful kind, about why certain areas never made it onto patrol schedules. Caleb, I said carefully, what's your location? Coordinates followed. Accurate formatting. Wrong structure. And when I pictured them, my stomach dropped. The point sat deep in the corridor, beyond the tree line. Everyone pretended it was just another boundary. No access trails. No reason for a trainee to be there. No reason for anyone to be there on Christmas night. I checked the frequency display. The call wasn't coming through our primary ranger channel. It was bouncing off a seasonal trail cam relay, equipment designed to send still images, not voice transmissions. The odds of a live distress call routing through that system were almost non-existent. Caleb, I said again, slower now, explain how you're transmitting. Static, then a faint click, like a switch being flipped the wrong way. I found a unit, the voice said. Didn't know it was active. Battery's low. I can hear you fine. That wasn't how those cameras worked. They didn't have speakers. They didn't receive. They barely transmitted. I stopped walking. The forest felt closer than before, trunks crowding inward, snow swallowing distance. My breath sounded too loud in my ears. I tried to remember the last time I'd personally seen Caleb Ross. He'd shaken my hand, thanked me for the mentorship, joked about not missing winter patrols. Caleb, I said, when was the last time you checked in? Another delay. Longer. Long enough that protocol whispered at me to log the call and wait for confirmation. A couple hours ago, the voice said, I think. Hard to tell. It's dark. Christmas night, dark wasn't confusing. It was absolute, and Caleb would have known that. He'd been trained to note time, direction, condition. His reports were always meticulous. I keyed the radio off and stared at the frequency log. The signal strength fluctuated even though I hadn't moved. Numbers jumped, then settled, then jumped again. My own last transmission echoed faintly through the speaker, warped, like it had been spoken back to me from a distance. Unit 12 responding. The echo whispered. I hadn't keyed the mic. A chill crept up my spine that had nothing to do with temperature. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. No wind. No wildlife. Just that heavy stillness again, coiled tight. Protocol was clear. No solo responses to deep corridor distress calls at night. Call it in. Wait for backup. Preserve ranger safety. But protocol assumed normal conditions. Normal equipment. Normal voices. Caleb, I said, pressing the transmit button again. Help is being arranged. Stay where you are. No, the voice said immediately. Too fast this time. No delay. Please don't wait. It's getting closer. What's getting closer? I asked. Silence. Then, softly, my own voice came through the speaker, repeating the question. What's getting closer? My heart hammered hard enough I could feel in my throat. Radios echoed sometimes, sure, but not like that. Not clean. Not intentional. Caleb, I said, fighting to keep panic out of my tone. Describe your surroundings. Trees, the voice answered. Same as everywhere else. That answer was wrong. Every ranger learned to describe landmarks instinctively. Slope, canopy density, sound. Caleb would have known that. I switched to a secondary channel. The voice followed instantly. I powered the radio down for a full 3 seconds, then turned it back on. Unit 12, the voice said calmly, as if nothing had happened. Do you read me? I felt suddenly, acutely alone. One ranger, 80 square miles, Christmas night, and a call that shouldn't exist, coming from a place no one patrolled for reasons never written down. If I waited and Caleb was real, he would die out there. Exposure doesn't care about rules. But if I went alone into that stretch of forest, I would be breaking every safety protocol drilled into me over 14 years. Evan, the voice said, it used my first name. I had never given it. How do you know that? I demanded. Another pause. Shorter, more confident. You told me. The voice said, when we trained. You said never to ignore a call. I hadn't said that. Not to him. Not to anyone. Snow creaked nearby, close enough that I spun toward the sound. My light cut through the trees, illuminating nothing but trunks and shadow. The radio crackled again, softer now, as if conserving energy. I can hear you walking, the voice added. You're almost here. I hadn't moved. The forest felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Depth collapsed. Distance bent. My instruments told me one thing. My instincts screamed another. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a memory surfaced. An old ranger, years ago, saying never answer voices that know your name beyond the line. I thought of Caleb Ross as he'd been. Eager, earnest, alive. I logged the call anyway. Time stamp, frequency anomaly, distress coordinates. My hand shook as I wrote, the pen dragging slightly across the page. Official records for something deeply unofficial. Caleb, I said one last time, stay where you are. I am, the voice replied. Too quickly, too sure. The radio clicked off on its own. For several seconds, there was nothing. Then a faint transmission returned, not words this time, just breathing. Slow, steady, patient. I stared at the dark wall of trees ahead of me. The invisible line every ranger sensed but never marked. Beyond it lay the coordinates I just logged. Beyond it lay answers I wasn't trained to face. Protocol told me to wait. Something else, older, quieter, told me that if I didn't move now, I never would. I stepped forward, crossed the tree line, and felt the forest close behind me, sealing the sound of the world away as if it had been waiting for me to choose. I stepped forward, crossed the tree line, and felt the forest close behind me, sealing the sound of the world away as if it had been waiting for me to choose. The change was immediate, not dramatic, not violent, just absolute, cold sharpened, not dropping in temperature so much as changing texture, biting cleaner against my skin. The quiet thickened until it felt padded. like the inside of a sealed room. Even my breathing sounded wrong, flattened, as if the air itself refused to carry noise any farther than necessary. Rangers joked about the tree line, but quietly, every corridor had one, even if maps pretended otherwise. An invisible boundary where terrain stayed the same, but perception shifted. Beyond it, sound didn't travel the way it should. We called it the sound drop. Radios crackled less. Footsteps felt muted. Gunshots, when there were any, seemed to vanish instead of echo. Crossing it always felt like stepping underwater. My boots sank into snow that should have crunched louder than it did. The beam of my headlamp cut a narrow tunnel through the dark, revealing trunks packed too tightly, branches overlapping in ways that made depth hard to judge. The forest wasn't denser here. It just felt closer, like it leaned inward when you weren't looking. I paused, listening. Nothing answered. No wind. No settling branches. Not even the faint tick of snow sliding from needles. The silence was complete enough to feel intentional. Behind me, the world I knew still existed. Roads, radios, backup. Ahead of me, those things became ideas instead of guarantees. I took another step. Then another. Snow behaved strangely past a line. My footprints formed clearly at first. Deep impressions, crisp edges. Then, after only a few steps, they softened. Not from wind. Not from falling snow. They simply lost definition, as if the ground rejected the memory of weight. When I turned to look back, the first prints were already fading. I told myself it was temperature variance, crust layers collapsing, rational explanations stacked neatly the way training taught. But my body didn't believe them. My shoulders stayed tight. My grip on the radio never loosened. The forest shifted around me as I moved, not following, not retreating. Pacing. That was the word that came to mind. Unbidden. Like something matching my progress without showing itself. When I stopped, the feeling stopped. When I walked again, it returned, steady and measured. I swung my light to the left. Nothing. To the right, more trees. Always the same distance away. Never closer, never farther. Isolation settled heavier with every step. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the certainty of being unaccounted for. Radios still worked, technically. GPS still tracked, technically. But those systems felt thin out here, like paper shields against something solid. I checked my coordinates again. They drifted slightly, then corrected themselves. The compass needle hesitated before settling. I marked the behavior in my log out of habit, even as part of me wondered who, if anyone, would ever read it. The superstition said never stop moving once you crossed. That standing still at the forest decide where you belonged. No one ever explained what that meant exactly, just that it was better to keep going. So I did. Time stretched without changing. My watch ticked, but the night didn't progress the way it should have. The sky between branches stayed the same deep, starless black. My sense of distance warped. 5 minutes felt like 20. 100 yards felt like a mile. Once, I heard something that might have been a footstep. Not behind me, beside me, matching pace. When I froze, it froze. When I moved, it moved. Never ahead, never overtaking. Just there. My heart thudded loud enough that I was sure it would break the silence. But it didn't. Even fear sounded muted beyond the tree line. I tried the radio again. Unit 12 checking in. I said. The words left my mouth and seemed to fall straight down. Static answered. Then, faintly, a distorted echo of my own transmission, delayed just enough to feel intentional. I shut the radio off. The trail no longer matched the map. Landmarks appeared where none should have been. A fallen log I didn't remember. A clearing too circular to be natural. Snow lay untouched in places that should have been scuffed by animals. The forest looked staged, like a careful imitation of wilderness. I thought again of Caleb Ross, of his questions, of the way he listened when others talked around certain topics. If he had crossed this line alone, the realization tightened my chest. My breath fogged in front of me, then vanished abruptly, as if absorbed. The cold no longer numbed. It sharpened, keeping me painfully alert. Every sense tuned too high, searching for confirmation that I wasn't imagining the pacing presence just beyond my vision. At one point, my light caught movement between trunks. I swung toward it, heart leaping, but found only empty snow. When I looked back at the ground, my most recent footprints were gone. Not faded, gone. Panic crept in then, slow and insistent. The kind that doesn't spike, but spreads. I forced myself to breathe evenly, counting steps, focusing on procedure. Training doesn't stop fear. It gives you something to hold while fear grows. The forest didn't rush me. It didn't need to. It let me walk, let me doubt, let me keep choosing forward. I began to understand why rangers avoided this place after dark, not because of what lived here, but because of what the place did to you. It eroded certainty, bent rules, made instincts argue with logic until neither felt reliable. Ahead, the trees thinned slightly, not an opening, just enough to suggest a change. My radio vibrated once at my side, powered off like a heartbeat. I slowed, every sense straining. Something waited beyond that thinning line. I didn't know what, only that the pacing presence had stopped, and the silence, for the first time since I crossed, felt expectant. The silence, for the first time since I crossed, felt expectant. I stopped just shore where the trees thinned, my light resting on a narrow stretch of snow that looked untouched, almost preserved. The pacing sensation was gone now, not retreated, not finished, just paused, as if whatever had been matching me step for step had decided it was close enough. That was when I heard my name, not over the radio, not echoed, spoken softly, from somewhere to my left, threaded between the trunks. Evan. The voice didn't carry. It didn't need to. It sounded as though it had been said directly into the space behind my ear, careful and familiar, like someone trying not to startle me. I didn't answer. Every instinct screamed not to. Training teaches you to identify sounds, to triangulate, to call back and establish contact. But this wasn't a search and rescue situation anymore. This was something else entirely, something no checklist accounted for. Evan, the voice said again, closer now, "You don't need the light." My stomach tightened. Only other rangers knew I habitually shut my headlamp off during night patrols to preserve night vision. It wasn't policy, just habit, just preference. The radio at my hip clicked once, then twice. 3 short bursts of static followed, uneven, almost rhythmic. I watched the device without touching it as the clicks began to space themselves out, pauses stretching between them. EVN, the syllables formed not as sound, but as interruption, as absence between noise. My name assembled from silence. I stepped back before I realized I'd moved. Snow compressed beneath my heel, loud in the stillness, and immediately the voice stopped. The radio went quiet. The forest resumed its watchful hush. My pulse hammered. I forced myself to slow my breathing, counting seconds in my head. Panic would make me careless. Carelessness would make me permanent. Another voice drifted in from the right this time, lower, older. "You're not supposed to be here this late." It used the cadence of reprimand, not threat, the tone of a supervisor, disappointed but calm. I almost recognized it. Almost. Faces flickered through my mind. Men who'd trained me. Men who'd retired. One who'd disappeared on a winter patrol years ago and was never found. I'd filed that report myself. Exposure. Disorientation. Tragic but explainable. I wasn't so sure anymore. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. The forest absorbed my light, trunks swallowing illumination instead of reflecting it. Depth collapsed again, distances flattening into a wall of dark. "Caleb?" I said before I could stop myself. The answer came immediately. "I'm right here." It was perfect. His voice, exactly as I remembered it. The slight hitch when he spoke too quickly. The careful enunciation. The nervous politeness he never quite outgrew. "Don't turn around," he added. "You'll lose the trail." There was no trail. My radio crackled softly, still powered off, and a series of clicks followed, faster now, like someone learning a rhythm. The pauses shortened. The pattern smoothed. "You're cold," the radio whispered, using my own voice. "You can stop." I shut my eyes, just for a second, and the darkness pressed harder. Memories surfaced unbidden. Briefings held in windowless rooms. Tribal representatives invited to speak and quietly ignored. Stories translated poorly into policy language. Warnings that didn't fit the framework we use to manage land. One elder had said, through an interpreter, that the forest remembered names longer than faces, that places left unmarked stayed alive, while mapped land grew brittle and loud. We nodded politely, thanked him, moved on. I remembered rolling my eyes afterward. Telling myself respect didn't require belief. Evan, the forest said again, gently this time, "You taught him well." Guilt flared hot and sharp. Caleb had shadowed me for weeks. Asked questions about the corridor, about the tree line, about why certain areas were never assigned. I deflected, made jokes, told him some things were just above his clearance. The voice used that memory now, pressing where it hurt. Snow shifted ahead of me, subtle, like something settling its weight. I raised my light, heart pounding, and caught nothing but shadow and trunk and more shadow. But when I lowered the beam, the snow where I'd been looking was disturbed, compressed just slightly, as if something had stood there and stepped away. I backed up again. My footprints reappeared behind me, crisp and deep, only to blur and vanish before my eyes. The ground refused to keep record. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, hating the tremor in my voice. The answer didn't come from one direction. It came from everywhere at once. Doing what? The mimicry sharpened. The radio clicks began forming longer strings, pauses arranging themselves into sentences without sound. My own breathing echoed back to me half a second late, synchronized wrong, like a recording played just off tempo. I understood then that it wasn't imitating voices. It was imitating systems, learning the way we communicated, the way we identified authority, the way we trusted familiar patterns over unfamiliar truths. I thought of maps, of blank spaces deliberately left unmarked because survey teams never returned consistent data, of coordinates that drifted, landmarks that refused permanence, of an old note in an archive file that said simply, "Area unsuitable for designation." Unmarked didn't mean unknown. It meant respected, avoided. The voices softened, coaxing now. "You can rest," one said, using my mother's tone, a memory I hadn't thought about in years. "Put the radio down," said another, wearing the voice of my first supervisor. "You've done enough." I clenched my fists until my nails bit into my palms, grounding myself in pain. This wasn't a predator. It wasn't chasing. It was offering, redirecting, nudging me toward stillness, toward staying. I remembered another thing the elder had said, almost as an aside, that some places weren't meant to be known fully, that marking them invited attention they did not want, that curiosity, in the wrong context, was a kind of theft. The forest shifted again, not closer, just different. The thinning ahead resolved into a faint clearing, edges too smooth, snow untouched by wind or fall. It looked wrong in the way unfinished things look wrong. My radio vibrated once more, harder this time, and a single click formed a word I didn't need to hear to understand. "Come." I knew then that whatever it called me here knew more than names. It knew temptation. It knew duty. It knew exactly which parts of me to use. And somewhere beyond that clearing, something waited that had never been meant to appear on any map. I took one slow step back, away from the voices, away from the offer, and felt the forest tense, like a held breath. It didn't follow. It didn't need to, because I finally understood that crossing the tree line wasn't the real boundary. Stopping was. Stopping was. I held there for a long moment, breath shallow, waiting for the forest to punish the refusal. Nothing happened. The voices faded, not abruptly, but like a radio dial slowly turning away from a station until only static remained. The pacing presence didn't return. Whatever had been offering itself was patient enough to let me reconsider. That restraint frightened me more than pursuit ever could. I forced myself to look down. The snow at my feet had changed again. Where my own prints had vanished earlier, a new set marked the ground ahead. Lighter, narrower, partially filled with powder. Boot prints. Ranger-issued tread. Real. Caleb's. They led toward the clearing, then veered sharply away, as if he'd stopped, reconsidered, and turned at the last second. The spacing told a story immediately. Short strides. Hesitation. Someone cold, tired, unsure. I knelt, gloved fingers hovering just above the impressions. The edges were softened but still readable. Hours old, not days. Christmas night old. My chest tightened as the realization settled in. He'd been here. The tracks didn't align with any map trail. According to every official chart, this stretch of corridor was a blank. No patrol routes, no access points. Yet Caleb's prints cut across it anyway, weaving through trees as if guided by something other than terrain. I followed slowly, careful not to step directly on them, though part of me wondered if the forest would allow them to persist regardless. Each time I paused to study the pattern, the air felt heavier, charged, like pressure before a storm. The route made no sense. Caleb's path looped back on itself twice, forming rough circles that tightened with each rotation. He'd walked in wide arcs at first, then smaller ones, as if searching for a landmark that refused to stay put. Several times, the track stopped entirely. Impressions clustered together where he must have stood still for minutes at a time. Listening, I swallowed hard and forced myself onward. At one point, his prints approached a stand of trees, so dense the light barely penetrated. The tracks slowed there, steps close together, toes angled inward. Fear leaves a signature if you know how to read it. So does obedience, because then, abruptly, the stride lengthened. The hesitation vanished. The steps straightened, purposeful, almost confident. He'd been given direction. I knew that walk. Every ranger did. The posture you took when responding to authority. When someone higher up told you exactly where to go. My throat tightened. Caleb. I whispered, the name slipping out before I could stop it. The forest answered with silence, so deep it rang. I checked the radio again. Still dead. Still heavy in my hand, as if it resented being ignored. I logged the track discovery with shaking fingers. Knowing the entry meant little without context I couldn't officially provide. The prints led me farther and deeper into the unmarked stretch. The trees closed ranks again, branches overlapping until my light struggled to find purchase. Shadows warped, stretching across the ground in shapes that didn't correspond to anything casting them. As I moved, the forest began to change its behavior. Snow shifted overhead, dumping softly from branches in small, sudden cascades that forced me to flinch. A sharp crack echoed once, when under stress. Then nothing. The silence snapped back into place like a trap resetting. I had the distinct sense of being watched again, not paced this time, but observed, assessed. Caleb's tracks faltered once more near a shallow ravine. The impressions here were chaotic. Overlapping steps, partial prints, heel marks pressed deep where he'd stopped abruptly. One set of tracks pointed toward the ravine's edge. Another pointed away. He'd stood here for a long time. I crouched, scanning the area. My light caught something half buried in snow near a fallen log. A glove. Ranger issue. I recognized the wear on the knuckles immediately. Caleb's. I picked it up slowly. It was stiff with cold. Fingers curled as if it had been pulled off in a hurry. Inside, the fabric was damp. He'd still been alive when he lost it. The forest reacted the moment I touched it. Wind surged through the ravine, sudden and violent, whipping snow into my face hard enough to sting. Branches groaned overhead. The temperature seemed to drop all at once, the cold sharpening into something punishing. I staggered back, heart racing, instinct screaming danger. Okay, I said aloud, not sure who I was addressing. I see it. The wind cut off instantly. The silence returned, heavier than before. I understood then that observation mattered, that noticing left a mark. The forest tolerated presence. It did not tolerate attention. Caleb's tracks resumed beyond the ravine, but they were wrong now. Too shallow, too evenly spaced, like someone walking without weight. The impressions barely disturbed the surface, as if the snow remembered him differently after a certain point. I followed anyway, guilt driving me forward harder than duty ever had. I should have answered his questions. Should have taken his unease seriously. Instead, I'd trusted protocol over pattern, policy over people. The trail ended abruptly in a small clearing. No body, no sign of struggle. Just smooth, untouched snow, pristine and wrong. In the center lay Caleb's radio. Antenna snapped cleanly in half, battery missing. I stood there, staring, breath coming fast, and felt something shift again. Not the forest this time. Me. I had crossed from search into aftermath, without realizing it. The trees around the clearing leaned inward, branches creaking softly. Snow began to fall in heavy, deliberate clumps, filling the last visible impressions of Caleb's path. The forest was erasing the evidence while I watched. I backed away slowly, clutching the glove. Every instinct telling me I'd reached the limit of what I was allowed to see. The clearing didn't follow. It didn't need to. Behind me, something moved, fast, close, deliberate. Not footsteps. Pressure. The forest exhaled. Hard. Branches snapped. Snow fell in blinding sheets. My light flickered, dimmed, then steadied. I stumbled, barely catching myself as the ground shifted underfoot, terrain reconfiguring itself in subtle, disorienting ways. I ran, not blindly, but urgently, following my own fading prints, trusting muscle memory more than sight. The wind howled now, no longer restrained, and with it came sound that might have been voices, might have been trees tearing under strain. I didn't stop until my lungs burned and my legs shook. When I finally dared to turn around, the clearing was gone. So were Caleb's tracks. All that remained was a glove in my hand, and the crushing certainty that whatever had taken him had done so without force. It had offered something, and he had followed. I knew then that finding Caleb was no longer the goal. Understanding what he'd answered was. And somewhere deep in the corridor, beyond where the forest reacted and erased, lay the rule we had never written down. The one that explained why some questions should never be asked, and why some voices should never be trusted, no matter how familiar they sounded. Understanding what he'd answered was. That thought followed me as I moved away from the clearing, clutching Caleb's glove like proof that I hadn't imagined any of it. My legs carried me on instinct, weaving between trees without conscious direction, guided by something older than maps. The forest no longer pressed or paced. It watched, and in that watching, a memory surfaced I hadn't let myself touch in years. There was an unofficial rule among rangers assigned to the corridor. It wasn't written. It wasn't spoken in briefings. It passed quietly, from one generation to the next, hidden in tone and omission. Never respond to voices pass a line. Not shouts, not calls for help, not even names you recognized. I'd learned it late. My first winter in Black Elk, a veteran ranger named Thomas Harlan had taken me aside after a night patrol. Harlan was the kind of man who treated land like a living contract. He'd worked the corridor since before GPS units were standard, before radio coverage improved. He knew the forest by absence as much as presence. "You hear something out there," he told me, not meeting my eyes. "You make damn sure it comes with a body attached." I laughed at the time. Nervous, eager, dismissive. He didn't. A year later, Harlan vanished. The official report said he'd gone out alone to check a boundary marker after a storm and never returned. Search teams found his truck, engine cold, driver's door open. His tracks led into the forest and ended abruptly, as if he'd stepped off the ground. Exposure was listed as cause of death. Case closed. But the older rangers stopped patrolling that section entirely after that, and the rule solidified. Standing there now, years later, holding proof of another disappearance that followed the same invisible pattern, I finally understood why no one had ever written it down. Writing something down made it permanent, made it real, and once real, it demanded explanation. Something survived only by staying unofficial. I moved carefully, senses stretched thin, replaying memories through a new lens. Calls logged and dismissed. Reports that never quite lined up. The way missing persons clustered around the same weeks, the same weather, the same stretches of forest. Christmas. Patterns spanning decades. Hidden in plain sight, because no one wanted to be the one to name them. Training taught us to trust authority. Radios, uniforms, rank, procedures. Survival out here depended on something else entirely. Knowing when authority could be imitated. Knowing when instinct mattered more than instruction. The forest had learned our systems. It didn't need to hunt when it could summon. Didn't need force when it could offer familiarity. It borrowed voices, wore them gently, and waited for obedience. I felt sick thinking of Caleb, walking those looping paths, responding not to danger but to reassurance, to something that sounded official enough to trust. A faint sound drifted through the trees ahead. Not a voice. Not quite. More like a distant radio squelch. Clipped and controlled. I froze. Every part of me screamed not to answer, not to engage, to keep moving and pretend I hadn't heard it. That was the rule. The one never written down. The one that separated those who returned from those who didn't. But guilt is louder than wisdom when it gets enough leverage. I thought of the viewer listening to this now. Of anyone who's ever felt that pull to respond, to investigate, to prove something isn't real by getting closer. People who grew up near places like this know what I mean. You feel it in your gut long before your brain catches up. The sound came again. 3 short bursts. Then a pause. My radio stayed silent. I didn't reach for it. Harlan's voice echoed in my memory. Make sure it comes with a body attached. I stepped sideways instead of forward, angling away from the sound, choosing distance over clarity. The forest shifted subtly, displeased but restrained. Snow slid from branches in a soft hiss. Something exhaled, slow and deep. The rule held. For now, as I moved, the corridor seemed to open slightly, as if testing whether I'd learned. I didn't relax. I didn't speed up. I trusted the instinct I'd ignored too many times before. Somewhere behind me, the sound stopped trying. That was worse, because it meant the forest had accepted my choice and adjusted its attention elsewhere, toward someone else, toward another voice that might answer. By the time I reached a familiar ridge line, my hands were numb and my thoughts felt heavy, like they were sinking into something deeper than fear. I knew then that what I'd uncovered was an anomaly. It was a system, one that predated uniforms and radios and rules. The one rule we never wrote down hadn't protected everyone. It had only protected those willing to believe it. And belief, I was learning, was a kind of survival gear. I paused, listening one last time before moving on, knowing the next step would take me further into answers I might not be able to carry back. Somewhere ahead, beyond the limits of training and denial, waited the truth about what the forest did with those who answered. And somewhere ahead, beyond the limits of training and denial, waited the truth about what the forest did with those who answered. I didn't have to go far to find it. The corridor narrowed into a shallow basin where the trees bent inward, their trunks arcing slightly, as if pulled by a slow, constant pressure. Snow lay smooth and unbroken across the ground, but the air felt disturbed, unsettled, like water after something large passes just beneath the surface. My watch buzzed once, sharp and sudden, then went dead. The second hand froze mid-tick. Time, I realized dimly, was no longer keeping pace with me. I slowed, every instinct warning me that I was close to something unnamed. Not another tree line, not a place marked by geography, a boundary that existed only when crossed. The forest held its breath. So, did I. Evan. Caleb's voice came from directly ahead. I stopped. He stood 20 yards away, half hidden between 2 trees, posture relaxed, hands hanging loose at his sides. His uniform was intact, his face pale but familiar, breath fogged faintly in front of him, syncing perfectly with the cold. "Thank God," he said, relief breaking through his voice. "I knew you'd come." Every detail was perfect, too perfect. The scuff on his boot toe, the way his shoulders hunched slightly against the cold, even the nervous habit of rubbing his thumb against his fingers. My heart pounded hard enough to hurt. "Caleb," I said, my voice barely working. "Step into the light." He didn't. "You don't need that," he replied gently. "You can see me just fine." The distance between us felt wrong. 20 yards that stretched and compressed depending on how I looked at it. When I focused on him, he seemed closer, When I glanced away, the space widened, elastic and unreliable. "Where's your radio?" I asked. He smiled, apologetic. "Dropped it. I was following instructions." "From who?" His expression flickered, just for a fraction of a second, like a skip frame. "You," he said. "You told me to wait here." I hadn't. Snow crunched softly behind me. I spun, light sweeping wildly, but found nothing. When I turned back, Caleb was closer now. 10 yards. No sound of movement. No tracks forming beneath his feet. Reality bent around him like heat shimmer. "I got turned around," he continued. "But it's okay. You found me. We can go back now." My watch ticked once, twice, then resumed normally, as if nothing had happened. The sky overhead looked unchanged, yet my sense of time felt stretched thin, like fabric pulled too far. "Caleb," I said carefully, "what did I tell you about voices past a line?" He hesitated, truly hesitated this time. "That rule doesn't apply here," he answered. "This isn't past anything." The forest leaned inward. I felt it then, the second boundary. Invisible, unmarked, pressing against my chest. One more step forward, and something irreversible would happen. Not death. Something worse. A kind of reassignment. Caleb took another step toward me. The ground beneath him remained pristine. "You're cold," he said. "You've been out too long. Just come closer." His eyes reflected my light wrong. Too evenly. Like glass. Images flooded my mind, years collapsing into seconds. Rangers before me. Harlan standing in the snow, listening. Others whose names I'd read on plaques and reports, whose disappearances never quite made sense. I saw them stepping forward, trusting what looked right, sounded right, felt earned. I understood then that this thing didn't take people. It replaced them. "What happens to you?" I asked quietly. Caleb tilted his head. "I stay useful." The words landed heavy and final. Snow began to fall, straight down, thick and deliberate, each flake identical. The forest hummed, low and constant, vibrating through my boots and bones. The unnamed boundary pressed harder, inviting. Protocol screamed at me to secure the missing ranger, to close distance, to make contact. Survival screamed louder. I took one step back. Caleb's smile vanished. The forest reacted instantly. The humming rose into a roar. Trees shuddered. Snow lifted from the ground and spiraled upward, defying gravity. Distance snapped back into place violently. The space between us stretching like a rubber band released. Caleb screamed, not in pain, in rage. His form distorted, edges blurring, features slipping in and out of alignment. For a split second, I saw something else layer beneath him, tall, wrong, undefined. Then the illusion snapped back, imperfect now, seems visible. "You don't get to leave," it said, voice no longer singular. "You came when called." I stumbled backward, nearly falling as the ground bucked underfoot. My light flickered wildly, shadows tearing across the snow. The second boundary surged forward, trying to catch me mid-retreat. I broke protocol completely. I ran, not toward safety, toward memory, toward the instinct that had carried me through 14 winters. I didn't follow maps. I followed fear sharpened into clarity. Behind me, the forest howled, branches snapping, snow blasting sideways in blinding sheets. Caleb's voice chased me, cycling through tones, pleading, commanding, familiar, furious. "Evan, Ranger, don't do this." The distance warped again. Steps stretched, minutes folded. My lungs burned but never emptied, time slipping unpredictably. I crossed the first tree line without feeling it, burst to the boundary like surfacing from deep water. Sound returned violently. Wind, my own breathing. The radio screaming to life at my hip, all channels erupting in static. I collapsed to my knees, gasping, snow biting through my pants. The forest fell silent behind me, boundary resealing like nothing had happened. When I looked back, there was no sign of pursuit, no tracks, no Caleb, just trees, waiting. I lay there for a long time, shaking, understanding finally settling into place. I had crossed something meant to be crossed only once, and I had turned away at the last possible moment. Protocol would never account for that choice, but it saved my life. And somewhere beyond the tree line, something else learned my name the hard way, was no longer sure I wanted to hear it. And somewhere beyond the tree line, something else learned my name the hard way. I stayed on my knees long after my body stopped shaking, afraid that standing would mean stepping back into whatever boundary I'd barely escaped. The forest remained still, ordinary even, as if nothing had happened. That was the cruelest part. Once you crossed back, it knew how to look harmless again. Eventually, training reasserted itself. Shock protocols. Self-assessment. I checked my hands for frostbite, my pulse for irregularity, my radio for damage. It crackled like it always had, every channel suddenly alive with routine noise. Dispatch chatter, weather updates, a world that had kept moving while mine had fractured. I reported in. Not everything, just enough. Search and recovery protocols triggered automatically. Within hours, headlights cut through the snow, engines growling, voices overlapping. The corridor filled with people who didn't belong there at night, and the forest tolerated them the way it tolerates weather, without resistance, without cooperation. Caleb Ross was officially declared missing by morning. By the second day, the language shifted. Exposure, disorientation, seasonal inexperience. The phrases assembled themselves easily, drawn from a library of familiar tragedies. I watched the narrative take shape in real time, polished and plausible, designed to close doors rather than open them. I submitted my report twice. The first version included anomalies, frequency irregularities, the trail cam relay, the glove, the distorted coordinates. It was thorough, factual, stripped of interpretation. I expected questions. Instead, I was called into a quiet office with no windows and offered coffee I didn't drink. A supervisor I barely knew skimmed the report, brow furrowing not with concern but irritation. He tapped the pages once, then slid them back to me. "Rewrite this," he said. "Stick to observable facts." Those were observable facts. I rewrote it anyway. The second report removed the trail cam frequency, removed the radio behavior, removed the mention of voices. Caleb's tracks were summarized vaguely. The glove became personal equipment recovered. Exposure moved from possibility to conclusion. The third version, the one that went into the system, was almost unrecognizable. Clean, efficient, final. Caleb Ross, deceased. 'Cause hypothermia following navigational error. No one argued. The glove disappeared into evidence storage and was never logged out again. The radio I'd found in the clearing was listed as unrecoverable, despite having been photographed, bagged, and tagged. The coordinates I'd marked were quietly flagged as erroneous data and scrubbed. I noticed these things because I was looking for them. I was also told, informally, over a cigarette outside the station by a man who had never given advice before, to stop asking questions. Some areas, he said, staring past me into the dark, don't benefit from attention. That was the closest anyone came to acknowledging what had happened. Caleb's family received condolences, folded flags, a story that made sense enough to survive. I attended the service in uniform, hands folded, eyes forward, listening to people speak about him in the past tense, about his dedication, his promise. I said nothing. The forest receded from my dreams at first, replaced by paperwork, debriefs, routine patrols. I returned to work quickly. Too quickly. There's a comfort in procedure when reality becomes unreliable. But the psychological aftermath doesn't announce itself. It settles. I stopped sleeping through the night. Radios made my skin crawl. Any delay in a transmission sent my pulse racing. I found myself cataloging voices unconsciously, searching for imperfections that no one else noticed. On patrol, I avoided the corridor without realizing it, took longer routes, made excuses. When forced to approach the tree line, I felt pressure behind my eyes, a sense of being evaluated. The forest never reached out again. That was worse. I requested counseling, framed carefully as occupational stress. The sessions helped in the way all partial truths help, enough to function, not enough to heal. I learned grounding techniques, breathing exercises. None of them addressed the core problem. Because how do you process an encounter that has no language? I began reviewing old files in my downtime. Missing persons, ranger fatalities, seasonal workers who never returned. Patterns emerged once I knew what to look for. Christmas week, night responses, unmarked areas, voices reported and dismissed. Decades of sanitized reports stacked neatly, each one incomplete in the same way. I wasn't the first to survive an encounter. I was just the first to step back. That realization carried weight, responsibility. If the forest learned through repetition, so did we, and we had failed to pass down the right lessons, choosing silence instead. The warning I'd received to stop asking questions came with unspoken understanding. I could keep my job, keep my record clean, keep pretending, or I could push. I chose survival over righteousness. At least then. Months passed. Winter broke. Snow retreated. The corridor looked ordinary again, green and indifferent. Tourists returned. The forest smiled for cameras. But every time I logged a call, every time I heard a voice crackle through static, I remembered Caleb standing 20 yards away, perfect and wrong. The knowledge didn't fade. It nested. And I understood then that what had happened wasn't over. It had only shifted into waiting the way the forest always did. Because it doesn't need to be acknowledged to persist. It only needs someone to answer. And eventually, someone always does. Because it doesn't need to be acknowledged to persist. It only needs someone to answer. After Christmas passed, I stayed. I kept my badge, kept my truck, kept filing reports that said nothing and meant less. On paper, I was still doing my job. In practice, I redrew my patrol routes without ever admitting it to myself. Certain zones quietly disappeared from my schedule. Drainages that once felt merely uncomfortable became non-existent. If a route took me too close to the corridor, I found reasons to reroute down trees with the concerns, time constraints that no one questioned. No one ever does. The forest changed after Christmas, but not in the way people expect. It didn't grow louder. It didn't threaten. It grew restrained, watchful, like an animal that has learned it doesn't need to chase. Snow melted unevenly that year, lingering longer near the tree line, clinging to shadowed ground weeks after everything else thawed. Birds avoided certain branches. Elk skirted wide arcs around invisible boundaries. On patrol, the radio behaved itself. No echoes, no mimicry. Clean transmissions, sharp and obedient. That scared me more than malfunction ever had. Silence can be compliance, but it can also be strategy. Locals noticed a shift before I did. By mid-January, small things began appearing near the forest edge. Bundles of pine boughs tied with twine. Coins pressed into frozen soil. Once, I found a thermos of coffee set carefully at the base of a tree just beyond the access road. Steam long gone, but lid still warm, as if it had been placed there recently. I logged none of it. When I asked around, people shrugged, said it was tradition, said their grandparents had done the same thing. No one used words like protection or offering. They didn't have to. People who live near places like this understand that respect doesn't require explanation. The moral burden of silence settled heavier than fear ever had. Every day I said nothing, I participated. Every sanitized report, every avoided question, every time I let a younger ranger joke about spooky woods, I reinforced a lie that ignorance was safety. I told myself I was protecting them, protecting myself. Some nights, that justification worked. Most nights, it didn't. Sleep became shallow and fractured. I woke before dawn, heart racing, convinced I'd heard my name carried on wind. That wasn't there. Coffee tasted wrong. Food felt like obligation. I started measuring time not in days, but in how long it had been since I last stood too close to the line. Emotionally, I was hollowed out. Not numb, worn thin. Every interaction felt like it cost something I couldn't afford. I laughed when required. I answered questions carefully. I avoided mirrors because my eyes looked older than they should have. I considered transferring. Even filled out the paperwork once. But the idea of leaving without understanding felt like abandonment, and the idea of staying without acting felt like betrayal. I existed in the narrow space between those options, wearing myself down by inches. The forest never punished me for my silence. That was the point. It didn't need to. It had already proven what happened to those who listened too closely. What happened to those who crossed the wrong boundary and kept going. My survival wasn't a warning to it. It was confirmation. By early spring, the corridor felt dormant, not safe, like a hell breath that could last years. The unmarked areas remained unmarked. Trail proposals stalled. Funding requests were redirected. Bureaucracy did what it always does best, avoided inconvenience. I began to understand that this wasn't just about one forest. It was about how systems handle what they can't categorize. How authority protects itself by redefining loss. How silence becomes policy without ever being written down. Caleb's name stopped coming up. New trainees arrived. The cycle continued, grinding forward on routine and optimism. I watched them laugh, ask questions, trust the radio. And I said nothing. That knowledge, that my silence made me complicit, was heavier than any pack I'd ever carried. It bent my posture, slowed my reactions. I started making small mistakes, nothing reportable, but enough to notice. One evening, as the light faded and the forest edge darkened, I found another offering. This one was different. No twine, no object, just words, scratched into the bark of a young pine with something sharp. Do not answer. The letters were rough, hurried, carved by someone who knew the risk of stopping too long. I stared at them until my eyes burned, then looked away, pulse pounding. I wasn't the only one who knew. That realization broke something open in me. Exhaustion flooded in behind it, complete and unforgiving. I couldn't carry this alone anymore. Silence had protected my body, but it was killing everything else. Standing there, wind whispering through branches that had never done me harm, I understood that survival had a cost I could no longer pay in isolation. If the forest learned through repetition, then so could we. And somewhere, whether through warning or confession, the truth needed to be passed on quietly, carefully, before someone else answered a voice that knew their name. Because Christmas would come again, and the forest would still be waiting. Because Christmas would come again, and the forest would still be waiting. I left the service 3 years later. Not abruptly, not dramatically. I finished my rotations, trained my replacements, turned in equipment that still smelled faintly of pine and cold metal. My exit interview was polite, uneventful. Burnout was written on the form. No one challenged it. No one asked why I'd stopped volunteering for winter patrols, or why my transfer requests had always skirted the same regions. On my last day, I stood by my truck longer than necessary, keys heavy in my palm, listening to the forest breathe. It didn't speak. That silence followed me into civilian life. I moved farther south, took work that kept me indoors, surrounded by people, noise, schedules. For a while, the distance helped. Radios faded into background sound. Snow became seasonal inconvenience instead of warning. I slept through the night again, but some knowledge doesn't leave when you do. Years passed. Caleb's face blurred at the edges, memory smoothing what fear had sharpened. I told myself that was healing. That time did what always does. Then one December, I found myself driving north without fully deciding to. The road was familiar enough to recognize, but distant enough to feel unreal, like a place remembered from someone else's life. Snow lined the shoulders. Pines crowded closer as I climbed. When I reached the old access road near the corridor, I pulled over and cut the engine. The forest looked exactly the same. Same density. Same shadows pooled beneath the trees. Same sense of restraint. Like a hell breath that had never been released. Years hadn't softened it. Seasons hadn't eroded it. Whatever waited there didn't age the way we do. I didn't cross the boundary. I stood just short of it. Boots on gravel. Hands in pockets. Heart beating faster than it had any right to. The tree line was invisible, but I felt it immediately. That pressure. That subtle shift in perception. Like stepping up to deep water without getting wet. The forest was quiet. Not empty. Waiting. I stayed for a long time, longer than was comfortable, scanning for changes. There were none. No offerings this time. No carved warnings. Just trees and snow and the faintest sense of attention, patient and unhurried. I realized then that it hadn't lost anything when I left. It had gained time. I turned away before dusk, unwilling to test whether it remembered me well enough to speak. Driving back, I kept the radio off, preferring the hum of tires on asphalt to any other sound. Now, telling this, I weigh every word carefully, because stories like this don't ask to be believed. They ask to be considered, to sit somewhere behind the eyes and change how you listen. I don't need you to fear forests. I don't even need you to avoid them. I need you to pay attention. Winter strips places down to essentials. Sound travels differently. Distance lies. Familiar things feel slightly wrong. And if you're ever out there, alone, cold, certain you heard your name carried on wind that doesn't exist, understand this. Help doesn't always announce itself with urgency. Authority doesn't always with the right voice. And not every call is meant to be answered. If you work in places like that, you already know the rules that aren't written. Trust them. If you don't, learn to listen for the silence between sounds. The moments where instinct speaks before logic catches up. I wish I'd trusted mine sooner. Sometimes I wonder if the forest still practices, still refines, still learns which voices work best. New names enter service rosters every year. New radios crackle to life. New people believe training is enough. I don't know if it remembers Caleb the way I do. I don't know if what I saw wore his face because it needed to or because it wanted to. What I do know is this. There are places that don't want to be mapped and boundaries that don't care whether you see them. And once something learns how to call you, it doesn't forget. So if you ever find yourself standing at the edge of a winter forest, radio humming softly at your side, and you hear a voice that sounds exactly right, pause. Ask yourself who benefits if you step forward. And remember that sometimes the most dangerous thing a place can do isn't chase you. It's wait. Because somewhere out there, beyond the tree line, something is very patient, and it's listening for new names. Title: I'm a forest ranger in northern Wyoming. The Christmas call came from the woods.